My favorite scholar, a man who could never be accused of a lack of erudition, is Professor George Szamuely, author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's humanitarian war on Yugoslavia, who joins me now from Hungary. Dr. George, welcome back to the show. Can I begin with the rather extraordinary story yesterday? Yet another journalist, writer, was blown up by the Ukrainian security services. Gonzalo Lira, frequent contributor to the show, was taken at gunpoint. Another journalist now behind bars, if not worse, at the hands of the Ukrainian security. One might put these things down to rogue elements, except Budanov, the head of Ukrainian security, was very clear with us in a statement that he made today. He said they were going to kill Russians and their propagandists anywhere in the world. In other words, placing the world on notice that a wave of international terrorism is on its way to them. Of course, if people are lucky, it will only be the Russian propagandist who's blown up. But if they're unlucky, well, it could be any of us who is blown up. This a sign of strength or a sign of weakness? A harbinger of things to come, or just the death throes of the Kyiv regime?
I think it's a sign of a terrorist regime. This regime that is in power in Kyiv, it came to power via an illegal coup. It has conducted itself entirely by violence, by terrorism, directed at civilians in the Donbass. And it's now continuing in the same manner, now targeting civilians. We've already had Daria Dugina, a young woman, murdered. We had a blogger murdered in a St. Petersburg cafe, and now an attempt on the life of a writer. But Russia really has to accept that this is not a war. This is not special military operations. This isn't a war about the Donbass. It is a war directed at that regime in Kyiv. And it has to think in terms of how would the United States have acted if there were such a terrorist regime in Mexico City that came to power via an illegal coup that was being armed to the teeth by Russia or China and was continually spewing hatred against the United States. Well, we know the answer. The United States would have invaded Mexico a long time ago. It would have gone straight into Mexico City. It would have kidnapped the president, would have taken him to the United States, imprisoned him in a federal penitentiary, and then he would have put him on trial in due course for war crimes, crimes against humanity, for terrorism, and so on. This is clearly what Russia needs to do. It needs to draw up a bill of indictment against Zelensky, his immediate advisors, against Poroshenko, who was in power after 2014. And do the same thing. I mean, this is a regime change operation. That's the only way this war can come to an end. Fighting it out in Bakhmut and going trench by trench, that doesn't really cut it. It has to be directed at that terrorist regime in Kyiv.
Russia certainly showed a great deal of forbearance. In former times, that forbearance would definitely not have been shown. As someone, as I said in my introduction, who was exactly where the rubble was in the Führer bunker, now a car park, I know for sure that the kind of things that are happening now would never have been tolerated. The bulldozing of Soviet Red Army war graves, for example. Indeed, the desecration in Germany yesterday of 400 Red Army graves, war graves. These are acts of war. The Polish example, this is an act of war. And there have been many, many such examples. And Donetsk is still being bombed, and civilians are still being killed there. Children in the Alley of Angels are still being murdered there. Why is Russia showing such forbearance?
Well, I think the problem is that Russia seems, unfortunately, too keen on winning arguments, somehow showing themselves to be the better party, almost like, Jesus Christ, turning the other cheek. They don't seem to realize it doesn't matter if you win an argument. It doesn't matter if you point to American hypocrisy or American double standards, or that NATO lied here and NATO lied there. It doesn't matter. They know they're lying. The only thing that they will understand, what they say about Russia, they understand the language of force. That's the only thing that NATO understands. And I think, Russians often criticize the Soviet Union, and there are things to criticize. There was the Great Terror, collectivization, and so on. But there was one thing that you have to admire about the Soviet Union: you didn't mess with them. They didn't joke around, and they inspired terror. People were frightened of messing with the Soviet Union. Russia, unfortunately, now is in a position where countries aren't frightened of it. You listed the various things that these tiny Baltic states do, that they desecrate wartime monuments, cemeteries. You have Poland seizing diplomatic buildings, all without any repercussions. And that's the difference. I mean, with the Soviet Union, you didn't do that. You knew there would be repercussions. And unfortunately, Russians still just want to win arguments and think that somehow it's all going to sort itself out. No, the only way that you're going to change anything is by winning this war in Ukraine, and doing it in as expeditious a manner as possible.
Well, as my good friend Robert Wyatt put it in a wonderful song, Stalin wasn't Stalin when he crushed the beast of Berlin. And I think it was Medvedev who said a week or so ago that those Germans who wish the invasion of Russia should be prepared for our victory parade in Berlin. But I've got to say, German public opinion, we'll see, but German public opinion seems resolutely set on a course of confrontation, even though they're being told by their own government not to shower every day. Imagine a German not showering every day, the cleanest people on the earth until a year and a bit ago. The Russian decision that will soon at least have to be made is whether it's bloodier to go on or to go, or whether steeped in blood so far, is it bloodier to go on or to go or, as the Scottish play put it. We've mentioned Stalin, who famously said that quantity is a quality, and the Russians don't lack quantity. Neither quantity of space nor quantity of people. They mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Have they even arrived at the front? Are they being felt? What do you think the game plan is?
Well, it's very hard to know, because I think, as you said, with Stalin, that's the law of military science. It's quantities that win. You need to throw in masses of manpower, masses of infantry, masses of firepower. That's how you win wars. And unfortunately, Russia did not commit the necessary manpower and firepower to win this. I don't know what the Russians were thinking. Maybe they thought that there'd be some sort of a coup in Kyiv that would remove Zelensky. Maybe they thought that Zelensky would cave very quickly, like Dubček caved in 1968. It didn't happen, and it doesn't look like Russia at the moment has a plan B. What they're doing now in the Donbass just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense strategically. It doesn't really make sense morally. It's contrary to their objectives. I mean, their objective is denazification. We have to crush the Nazi regime, not, we don't have a problem with the Ukrainian people, it's the Nazi regime. But at the moment, the Nazi regime is doing very nicely. It's Ukrainian people and Russian people, of course, who are dying in Bakhmut. And that's because, it's very hard to make any progress in the Donbass. I mean, NATO has heavily fortified it. They got trenches, they got mines. They've been waiting for 8 years for this war. So it doesn't make sense to go on fighting there. what makes sense is to go for Kiev, to crush this regime, as I say, arrest Zelensky, put him on trial. That's the way you win this war. The initial plan, if it was that they could overthrow Zelensky by a coup and there wouldn't be any heavy fighting, that hasn't worked. So they need to, basically move to Plan B. And it's the problem is that regime. It's not the Ukrainian people.
Now, what about the points I made earlier, George, Dr. George? It's evident a walk in the capital cities of European countries now makes plain at a glance. Just look around you at how we have fallen, and this in the service of a senile American president presiding over a country which could scarcely be more dysfunctional. Europeans, you're in one now, in the great capitals of Europe. Europeans are an ancient civilizational force with very high levels of very good quality education and so on. How did it come to this?
Well, I think that we have throughout Europe a kind of bought and paid for elite. These are people who have been brought along through American money, through the patronage of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, through the patronage of the likes of George Soros. So it's the elite that has emerged in Europe. It's not in any sense representative of the European peoples. They're bought and paid for. They punch their ticket as they're prime minister of this, foreign minister of that, and then afterwards they go on to some big bureaucratic job, making a lot of money, and then maybe getting a cushy professorship somewhere in the United States. So this is a completely artificial elite, and unfortunately, also Europe has been completely swamped by American culture. There isn't really any kind of a European culture anymore. It's all just offshoots of America. And you watch any kind of European TV shows, it's all just replicas of what they do in America. The Europeans embrace every American fad. They embrace George Floyd and taking the knee, Black Lives Matter. They've embraced transgenderism. Anything that the Americans come up with, the Europeans just mindlessly mimic. And of course, now you have this politically, and they're destroying their own economies, destroying themselves as any kind of economic force for coming generations. And for what? But that's it. This is part of this sort of groupthink orchestrated by the United States, where there were once European leaders who stood up to the United States, whether it was de Gaulle in the 60s, Willy Brandt in the 70s, even Helmut Kohl to a certain extent in the 1980s. They've gone. They're not there anymore. It's just one kind of meaningless creature. Like the Finn chick who was there. And they're interchangeable. None of them really represents any kind of a constituency.
I stood outside Willy Brandt House, the headquarters of the SPD in Berlin, just 48 hours ago, George, and I got to thinking quite a bit about him. In retrospect, a greater, taller man in world affairs than I had perhaps thought at the time. One thing is for sure, from Brandt to Schulz is a long way down. From de Gaulle to Macron is a long way down. Even from Thatcher to Sunak is a long way down, though I didn't have much time for Thatcher. We could go across the horizon in Europe. You're a political scientist of great note. What's the reason for the decline of our political class? Why did it shrink so?
I think they lost any connection with their electorates. I think they pursued agendas that were set by others. whether set by the World Economic Forum, by George Soros, above all by the United States. That's what they really cared about. I mean, you've made an excellent movie about Tony Blair. He's really the model of the new politician, the killing of Tony Blair. In other words, yeah, you do that, you punch your ticket as prime minister, and then you go on to make a huge amount of money serving all kinds of paymasters. That's the European political model today. So when you do your bit in the cabinet and in foreign ministries, that's just preliminary to your real task, which is to make a ton of money. And so that's what Europe is. Europe is now doesn't exist in Asia. There isn't a European culture. There's no European civilization. It's just an appendage of the United States. That's what was so really disgraceful about yesterday's coronation, because of course it was magnificent. And there was, it's a root, 1,000-year history. There was an amazing thing that they were celebrating, and yet the United Kingdom is just simply does the bidding of Washington. I mean, there's nothing here that has any relevance to this ancient, magnificent tradition that was being celebrated, because in reality, all of those Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer and the rest of them who were sitting there, they don't represent any kind of an ancient Britain. They represent a political elite that does the bidding of Washington, and whatever Washington will say to them, they will do, irrespective of any national interests of the British people.
Dr. George, always a pleasure, a privilege, in fact, to hear you speak. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.